Good afternoon. Thank you all for taking time to attend this online side event, which is about UAE and Interpol. And also, it has another title. Major General Ahmed Naser Al-Raisi is not qualified to be the president of the Interpol. Well, for us, it is very important to express our views about this very important issue. But before that, let me introduce to you our distinguished speakers. We have with us our colleagues, Heba Ziadin. She's a leading researcher on UAE within Human Rights Watch, who have put endless effort to enhance the protection of human rights, defenders in the country and elsewhere. And also with us, Inat Osman, co-founder and director of MENA Rights Group, which is based in Geneva, and worked hard to use the UN various mechanisms to improve the human rights situation in UAE and other Gulf countries. Also with us, Rhys Davies. Rhys Davies is a UK barrister and specializes in international criminal law and international human rights law. And also we have Emily Libever, who's a partner lawyer at Bourdon Associé Law Firm in Paris. Surely we welcome you all. And let me just give us a brief introduction about the topic. Now, I have to say that the UAE is trying to get the position of the president of Interpol. And we believe strongly that will put at risk the global police organization's commitment to its human rights obligation. Now, we know very well that the General Secretariat of the Interpol, which is doing coordination for the day-to-day activities, is run by the president. And this is very serious matter for us when a country like UAE is trying to lead this organization. There are a lot of issues related to such a topic. And maybe I will just mention the red notices that usually a system used by Interpol. And we really strongly believe that this system will be misused by UAE through Major General Ahmed Naser Al-Raisi. Now, Ahmed Naser Al-Raisi himself, he joined the police force in 1980. And since 2015, he became the General Inspector of the Ministry of Interior. Now, our colleague, Ahmed Mansour, who is member of the board of the Gulf Center for Human Rights and also is involved with the MENA section of Human Rights Watch, was arrested on the 20th of March 2017. He was tortured. Still, Ahmed Mansour, until this minute, he's still placed in solitary confinement. So surely, Major General Ahmed Naser Al-Raisi has a responsibility. And for that and for other massive violations in UAE, we strongly don't think that he himself or UAE should get this position. Now, there is another issue really related to this matter, which is the fact that there is not even one single human rights defender who's not out of a prison. Mostly, either they are fled the country or they are in prison. All members of UAE, UAE 94, few of them outside. But look at this. On 13th of September 2021, the Cabinet of Ministers in UAE approved a resolution in which it listed four defenders. One of them is a researcher in a list of terrorism. So the government's terror list now includes 3 human rights defenders and a researcher. All of them are members of the UAE 94, a group of activists, lawyers, academics who are still in prison due to their peaceful human rights activities. So the danger is there. We believe that Interpol and this recent development in UAE itself, it means there is a link, and there are attempts by authorities, top authorities in UAE, to bring those people who are still working on human rights issues in Emirates, bring them back to UAE. With that, I stop and I hand over to my colleague, Hebe. She's going to give us a general overview of the topics: UAE intervention in Yemen, torture, use of surveillance equipment to target human rights activists, including the recent Pegasus project. Hebe, please.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Khalid, for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me well. So I'm just, like Mr. Khalid said, I'm just going to give a brief, kind of lay the groundwork for why the UAE or a representative of the government should absolutely not head such an international organization as Interpol. The UAE government is arguably one of the worst human rights violators, not just in the region, but across the world. And this has been well documented by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, the Gulf Center, and many other human rights organizations. The situation in the UAE had significantly worsened starting in 2011, as authorities responded to popular uprisings in the Arab world by cracking down on peaceful dissent, by arbitrarily detaining scores of activists and perceived critics of the ruling elite, disbanding the elected boards of civil society organizations, and preventing peaceful demonstrations. The UAE soon after introduced new laws and amended already repressive ones to more easily stamp out dissent. The government arbitrarily detains and forcibly disappears individuals within the UAE's borders who criticize the authorities. UAE residents who have raised human rights issues are at serious risk of arbitrary detention, imprisonment, torture. Many are serving long prison terms or have left the country under pressure, as Khalid had already said. Especially over the past few years, the UAE government has also dramatically scaled up its surveillance capabilities, both online and through mass monitoring of physical spaces, which has prompted experts really to list Abu Dhabi and Dubai among the world's most closely surveilled cities. We know that websites, blogs, chat rooms, social media platforms are also heavily monitored and curtailed. The authorities block and censor content online that they perceive to be critical of the UAE's rulers. The torture allegations are well documented. Due process violations are well documented. Citizens and residents both face heavy fines and imprisonment for social media posts. Virtual private networks are criminalized. The UAE authorities, especially in the last couple of years, we've seen investigations by major media outlets that have showed that authorities have spied on international journalists, activists, even world leaders, using sophisticated Israeli and EU-produced spyware, or with the help of former US intelligence officials. Some of those whose communications and devices were targeted by the government and who are residents of the UAE were subsequently arrested and abused in detention. One of those is Ahmed Mansour. A UAE court had sentenced Mansour to 10 years in prison in May 2018, following a grossly unfair trial. And it was partly based on private email exchanges and WhatsApp conversations. A Citizen Lab report from 2016 had demonstrated that 5 other cases were arrests or convictions of users following malware attacks against their Twitter accounts from between 2012 and 2015. This repressive environment has really led to a huge self-censorship among citizens, residents, journalists, academics, businessmen, and others who frequent the UAE. And of course, it's not just dissidents or critics who suffer as a result of the UAE's fundamental lack of respect for the rule of law and its unjust state security apparatus and its use of sophisticated spyware. This system has ensnared foreign journalists, expat business persons, and even British football fans. Once someone falls afoul of the authorities, we know that they are likely to face a host of due process violations. Human Rights Watch has documented serious allegations of violations of fair trial guarantees in the UAE, and especially in state security cases. Of course, the UAE has not kept this within its borders. It has exported its tactics of repression and control outside its own borders as well. We have documented abuses by UAE-backed forces, by UAE-trained forces in Yemen and in Libya. And despite announcing the withdrawal of most of its ground troops from Yemen in 2019, it remains a part of the Saudi-led military operations. It continues to maintain a presence in Aden, continues to provide support for certain Yemeni forces who have committed grave abuses over the past several years. The UAE has displayed an absolute disrespect for the rule of law and for human rights for far too long, yet it is rarely ever held accountable for any of these human rights abuses. Partly, it's because for the past 2 decades, it has pursued a soft power strategy through which it whitewashes its image and deflects from the abuses it commits regularly and even increasingly. Today, unfortunately, outside of the human rights community, the UAE does enjoy an image as an open, tolerant, to a certain extent, rights-respecting state. This has helped it avoid the international scrutiny that it deserves. And of course, since at least 2015, the UAE has ignored or denied requests for access to the country by UN experts, by human rights researchers, and critical academics and journalists. And even journalists inside the country are subject to stonewalling, to censorship, to surveillance. And so that results in less scrutiny by international media of the UAE's human rights record. This is really this is the government that we are dealing with right now, and that is sending one of its representatives to head Interpol. This is just one of its many tactics to gain influence, to present itself and really exert influence outside of its own borders. And I think there really needs to be a concerted effort to counter this, this strategy of the UAE's, this soft power strategy that they have pursued to a certain extent successfully outside of the human rights community. I think I'll stop there. I know other speakers are going to get into more detail about some of these issues. Thank you, Naser.
Thank you a lot, Hebe, and thank you for mentioning the state security apparatus. Really, if we want to go through the years, all the documented violations committed by the state security apparatus against human rights defenders, you will see that really they are very brutal when it's about defenders or about the prisoners of conscience. Still, we have some activists, including 2 female activists. They are still in prison despite the fact that they serve the full sentences. And when it's about criminals, once they are released, they could travel anywhere. All the defenders, the activists, even if they are released, they will serve an immediate travel ban. So they are treated worse than criminals. And all the illegal activities of the state security apparatus really need to be addressed and need to be highlighted. So the international community will take some immediate actions. That is very much needed. And as such, really, again, we will see that this country shouldn't lead the Interpol. Now I go to my colleague, Inas Osman, who will talk about the counter-terrorism framework in the UAE and how that makes them totally unfit to lead an organization such as Interpol. Inas, please.
Thanks a lot, Khalid. I would like to actually focus on one of the crimes that Interpol is fighting against or is supposed to fight against, and that is terrorism. Electing Al-Raisi as president would truly undermine Interpol's credibility in combating terrorism, because in the UAE, peaceful dissent is considered a form of terrorism. So first of all, if we take a look at the UAE legal framework, the first problem is that terrorism is defined in a very vague and broad manner. So an act of terrorism is not necessarily something violent. A terrorist offense can be anything that is deemed to threaten the state's stability, safety, unity, sovereignty, or security. And a terrorist can be anyone who declares his opposition to the state or to the ruling system. So essentially, it's quite clear that any form of public criticism, peaceful opposition can be considered terrorism. And as was highlighted by my colleagues before, there's many prisoners of conscience who have been prosecuted on the basis of terrorist accusations, often coupled with charges under the cybercrime law and the penal code, which are actually equally restrictive of fundamental rights and freedoms. Under the counterterrorism law, it's worth highlighting, as Khalid mentioned earlier, that the UAE cabinet can actually issue a list of terrorist organizations or persons that allegedly pose a threat to the state. The problem is that the law actually provides no criteria to establish how a person or an entity can be added to that list. And earlier this month, 4 members of the UAE 94 were added to that list. Those people are all based outside, and they're not terrorists, but either political activists or human rights defenders, and some of whom we actually have been closely working with. The problem now is that they have no way to challenge this arbitrary decision. And the irony is that we expect this listing could lead to, for example, the UAE issuing arrest warrants against those 4 men that could eventually be circulated through Interpol. So this kind of demonstrates the absurdity of having a country like the UAE or an official from the UAE presiding Interpol. The UAE legal framework also provides for the establishment of Munasaha Centers. So those are centers that are allegedly supposed to rehabilitate, enlighten, counsel individuals who were convicted for terrorism, but also anyone who is deemed to hold terrorist, extremist, or deviant thoughts, which can obviously mean anything and everything. The problem with those rehabilitation centers is, first of all, when you're held under that regime, it's actually a form of administrative detention, and it can be renewed indefinitely. So you don't have to appear before a judge to have that detention actually ordered, and you can end up for 20 years, with no court judgment, no proper legal basis under that regime. And this is what Khaled referred to. There is a number of individuals, prisoners of conscience, who actually have served their prison sentences already, but they're still being held under that rehabilitation regime. The last but not least point that I would like to highlight is that being convicted of terrorism can have other far-reaching consequences in the UAE. And one of them is that under the nationality law, someone can be deprived of their citizenship if they are convicted of a terrorist offense. This has been the case with certain members of the UAE 94 who had their citizenship revoked. And as a result, their children also ended up being stateless. For those who could not leave the UAE, it essentially means having no access to employment, no access to education, and even no access to healthcare. And just to give an example, the daughter of one of the UAE 94 actually was not even allowed to receive her COVID vaccine just because she's stateless. So with all of this in mind, we can clearly see that the UAE have used this counterterrorism as a pretext to crack down on peaceful dissent and are unfit to preside an agency that is supposed to fact actual acts of terrorism. And I just want to finish by highlighting that in November of last year, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism sent a communication to the Emirati authorities raising concern over some of the matters that I just raised. But the UAE has ignored this communication and not provided any comments. I will share the link in the chat if some of you are interested in taking a look. Voila. Thank you, Khalid.
Thank you a lot, Inas. And thank you really for mentioning the four men, Ahmed al-Shiba al-Naimi, Muhammad al-Zuabi, Hamid al-Shamsi, and Saeed al-Tunaiji, the four men who were added to the terror list of the UAE. Now, we know them really, they are targeted just due to their peaceful and legitimate human rights work. Even one of them is a researcher, and he's not involved in that much of activities, but we know very well that the UAE is looking for them just due to the fact that they are members of the UAE 94 and due to their activities, as I said. And really, there are a lot of fears among activists in UAE that the UAE is trying its best to misuse the red notice system. As you know, it is a request to law enforcement worldwide to locate individuals and enforce extradition. Now, if they are going to be extradited to UAE, we know what is waiting for them. Surely prison and probably torture, as it happened to most of them. So this is a very important issue that we need to highlight all the time. With that, I move to our colleague, Rice David, who is going to talk about the problem of Interpol funding and the Interpol Foundation work for a safer world, and how the UAE is trying its best to buy favor with Interpol. Please, Rice. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for organising this, and also thank you to the other speakers for participating. What I'm going to talk about very briefly is the report that we assisted in the preparation of earlier on this year. This as an issue, the funding of Interpol has been on my radar for a number of years now. But it came to a head midway through last year when rumours began to leak out that we've all now heard that Major General Al-Raisi is effectively the front runner candidate for the presidency. At present, and as ever, no formal list of candidates has been announced by Interpol. That is their policy. We made that a clear point of criticism when we assisted in the drafting of the report, and I know that other organisations and institutions have also criticised Interpol for that approach. The response from Interpol to that criticism is effectively, well, there is no formal list of candidates until the opening of the General Assembly. And really, if there's no formal list, we can't tell you who's running. Now, it seems to me that there are two responses to that. The first one is that obviously that's nonsense. It is well known in certain circles that there are campaigns underway. And the failure to publicise those campaigns beyond the other Interpol delegates, it seems to me, is anti-democratic. But even setting that aside, it seems to me that if you have a system by which none of the candidates are publicised or can be publicised until the window that is the 2 or 3 days of the assembly itself, that system is obviously broken and needs reform. But the reason that this is obviously so important is that the General Assembly is due, I think it's November now, end of October, beginning of November in Istanbul. It was previously, somewhat remarkably, going to be in the UAE. And that was obviously postponed last year for reasons which we're all very familiar with. So we became aware a few years ago that there appeared to be a financial connection between the UAE and Interpol, and at the beginning of last year, we thought that it was something which needed to be investigated, and we were approached by various individuals and rights groups who asked us to look into this. And then we spoke with Sir David Calvert-Smith, who's the former Director of Public Prosecutions in England and Wales, and also a former High Court judge in England and Wales. And he is a very senior, well-respected lawyer who very kindly agreed to look at this issue and analyze it and report back. So with him, we assisted in the preparation of a report which was published, I think it was March of this year. And what we wanted to examine was a number of things. First of all, we wanted to examine the mechanism by which the president is elected generally. Secondly, the state in very broad, although fairly limited terms of Interpol, the scandals, the difficulties, the good work that it does. And we also wanted to look at the connection with the UAE and Interpol, and also the UAE's candidate. As I say, at present, there are, as far as I'm aware, there's one front runner, Major General Al-Raisi. There is potentially a Nigerian candidate in the wings as well, who may have backing from China. As an aside, I make the observation that Nigeria itself is not exactly a country which has the most robust criminal justice system. So I would be deeply nervous at the election of a Nigerian candidate, although not as nervous as I would be at the election of an Emirati candidate. And it seems to me, and it's worth making this point now, that what needs to happen at the forthcoming election is that democratic nations firstly need to get together and choose a suitable candidate. And I'm not saying that it should come from any particular country, but what I'm saying is there needs to be a change in attitude towards the types of candidates that are elected as the president of Interpol. The president is in part a figurehead, but he does steer the agenda. And as we all know, figureheads, even if he didn't steer the agenda, figureheads are important. And that is why repressive regimes like to infiltrate organizations such as Interpol. One thing which I reject out of hand is any suggestion, well, it doesn't really matter. It matters greatly. Prestige, agenda setting, and influence generally. And apart from anything else, if Al-Raisi was to be elected the president of Interpol, it would be a vindication of the way that they conduct their policing, and a vindication of the way that they've approached their human rights framework over the last few years, and they certainly don't deserve that vindication. So as I say, I reject out of hand any suggestion that this doesn't really matter. It matters greatly. So we conducted that analysis, and we concluded, or rather, and I say we presumptuously because we worked on this report, and that is a slip of the tongue. So David concluded, and of course we wholeheartedly adopt what he said. He concluded that there is obviously a sustained ongoing abuse of the red notice system by the UAE, one of a number of half a dozen, maybe 10 countries that seem to have a constant failure to properly use the system. And that of itself, in my submission, should be enough to disqualify an Emirati candidate. You ought not to have a candidate coming from a country which abuses the essential weapon which is available to your organization. That should disqualify an Emirati candidate. Secondly, we found in broad terms, and this will come as no surprise to anyone who's listening, that the UAE does not respect human rights properly or at all. And again, that of itself should be a disqualification for an Emirati candidate having his hand on the tiller of such an important organization. We also found that there is a very significant question hanging over Interpol and the UAE with regards to its funding mechanisms, and whether or not there is undue influence exerted by the UAE on Interpol by way of its funding. I'll come back to in just a few moments' time the Interpol Foundation for a Safer World, because it does bear scrutiny. And finally, taking all those 3 points together, alone, we would say that the Emirati candidate, Major General Al-Raisi, is unsuitable. But even if you set all that aside, one just needs to examine his own personal record. And even if you could make the case, which you cannot, that an Emirati candidate should be the president of Interpol, it shouldn't be this man. And I know that our speakers already and subsequent speakers will speak on this particular point with case studies, but we know as a matter of fact, it's well publicized, that there are apparently very serious questions that Major General Al-Raisi has to answer about his involvement, say, in the Matthew Hedges case, amongst others. So there are clear, credible reports tending to suggest that this is a man who, at the very least, on his watch, has overseen cases of serious rights breaches. We examined the mechanism by way of how the president is elected. As I've already touched upon, the mechanism clearly isn't working properly, because you need, particularly against the backdrop of the historical problems that Interpol has had in terms of its election of Presidents Meng Hongwei, the Russian candidate a few years ago, etc., etc. One needs to see a clear, transparent electoral system, and that doesn't exist. And as I say, one can't simply say, well, it all comes out on the 2 or 3 days and there's electioneering then. This needs to be a situation in which everybody who has a stake in this, and that's the entire global community, is able to say in advance, we don't think these are the right sorts of candidates. Red notices, I'm not going to speak on a great deal, safe to say that we all know that the UAE is one of the worst abusers. Their particular speciality, it seems to be, is the criminalization of debt. And we know the way that checks are still used in all manner of situations, particularly when it comes to property in the UAE, and checks are issued in advance, for example, for mortgages or for rentals. And that is a system which is open to abuse, because a landlord or a bank or whoever it is can seek to cash blank checks which have been posted, thereby creating an unenforceable debt. And then individuals either flee the country or they are criminalized. But in any event, that criminalization is used to issue red notices. We also know that the Emirates is a keen user of rendition. We know that there is a significant problem with the human rights landscape. And again, I won't speak on that today, because I know that the other speakers have already mentioned that, and others will speak about it as well. So I think the most important thing that I want to touch on is the question as to how is it that the Emirates can be accused of buying influence in the UAE. The mechanism by which this is taking place is the Interpol Foundation for a Safer World. It's an organization which was set up in 2013, didn't make, I think, any donations to anyone. And obviously it's an Interpol linked organization, but to anyone or Interpol, I think, until 2015. It appears to have no other purpose, apart from some window dressing, no other purpose other than to funnel donations from the UAE to Interpol. And there appears to be no other nation that is providing finance to the Interpol Foundation for a Safer World. And it really exists simply for that purpose. What are the funds that it has been providing? Well, when we completed our report, we looked at a snapshot for 3 years, 2017, 18, and 19. In very broad terms, Interpol receives about, give or take, 150 million euros per annum in funding. A modest sum of that, 20–30%, is in-kind funding, police officers, equipment, that sort of thing. And the remainder is funded by way of two mechanisms. One is a statutory funding requirement, which is calculated according to a formula. The US gives the highest sum, the Emirates gives a fairly modest sum, which I think is in the hundreds of thousands per annum. So very, very slight sums. Yes. So the UAE's statutory contribution, I think in 2018, was 231,000 euros. So not very much at all. Probably the salary of a couple or three Interpol officers. However, back in 2014 or 15, they announced a donation of 50 million euros. And what that means is that the Interpol Foundation for a Safer World has been catapulted to be the single largest donor in absolute terms, in a single gift, to Interpol. And just to put that in context, what you're looking at, a 50 million euro donation, is effectively the same amount, give or take, as all the other voluntary donations combined. These are not precise figures, but I'm hoping you're getting the picture. Now, Interpol says, well, it doesn't matter because this is spread over 5 years. I'm not sure that makes the argument any stronger, because of what it does show is that on a year-on-year basis, the UAE comes in as the second or third funder of Interpol. And I had a look yesterday at the 2020. So these are the updated figures. So in 2020, the total funding was 136 million euros, 60 million statutory contributions, 35 million voluntary in kind, and voluntary cash contributions. So that's what the Interpol Foundation would fall into, is 41 million. So you're looking at a sum that's being provided, which is greater than the total annual contribution, albeit spread over 5 years. And in 2020, the largest contributor was the European Commission, 7.8 million, second largest Interpol Foundation, 6.1 million, third largest, just to put this in context, US Department of State, 4.7 million. So you can see that the foundation is an enormous contributor to the wealth of Interpol. After the report was published, we got some correspondence from Interpol criticizing the report, saying there were lots of mistakes, insinuation, errors, whatever it is. A large part of that criticism seemed to be, for example, where we had used the wrong acronyms, some typos, things of that nature. But one of the things which I found particularly striking was the suggestion that, well, not suggestion, the straightforward assertion that the Interpol Foundation supports 7 Interpol projects on counterterrorism, cybercrime, cultural heritage, vulnerable communities, vehicle crime, drugs, and illicit goods. And it also, the response that we saw also made reference to the fact that the foundation made significant contributions to an incident response team in Sri Lanka. That's all very well and good, but it doesn't matter. These sums are spent on good causes. What matters is where the sums have come from and why the contribution has been made. And it is difficult to reconcile, in my view at least, this sudden, voluntary, enormous contribution. And let's not forget, this is pocket change for the Emirati government, but it's a big deal for Interpol. It's difficult to reconcile that with a spontaneous act of charity by the UAE, particularly against the backdrop of a number of links between the UAE and Interpol, the General Assembly taking place there, a number of other well-publicized initiatives, as well as the fact that we now have the lead candidate as being from the UAE. I should say in the rebuttal document that I have seen, it says this, quote, "Any claim that the UAE has undue influence in relation to any policy, budget or operational decisions by the Interpol General Secretariat headquarters is categorically false," end quote. That is not the allegation that is being made. The allegation is a much broader one, which is by pumping money into Interpol, somehow the UAE is currying favor. The rhetorical question was also posed to us in the rebuttal. It's noted that, quote, "There is no allegation of undue influence in reference to the 2 largest contributors or in relation to the 2 top 5 external contributors, the US Department of State and the Norwegian Agency for Development and Cooperation." The other 2 contributors are the European Commission and Global Affairs Canada. The quote carries on, "However, the report says that the donation made by Interpol Foundation for a Safer World merits further scrutiny. Why? Question mark, end quote. The answer to that is obvious. You have a small nation effectively coming from nowhere, making significant financial contributions alongside apparent closer links with Interpol, against a backdrop of abuse of the system, against a backdrop of human rights abuses, and all of a sudden the leading candidate comes from that country. Of course, that merits further scrutiny. And that's why we were asked to carry out that investigation. The clear inference is that there has been an attempt, and I'm not saying it's been a successful attempt, but the clear inference is there has been an attempt to somehow insinuate, or rather curry favor with Interpol by the UAE. And as we lawyers are fond of saying, not only must justice be done, but justice must be seen to be done. And in a situation such as this, it seems to me that we really need to have that kind of transparency, and that transparency appears to be lacking. So for those reasons, the report concluded that Major General Al-Raisi was not a fit candidate. One thing which I'll just close on, I noted when I was looking again last night at the Interpol Foundation for a Safer World that the website had changed somewhat, and I was trying to work out what the change was, and I realized as I looked at it that in fact the number of board members has changed. It went from 11 down to 10. The foundation website has lots of fairly vacuous, inconsequential news postings, although none over the last couple of years that I could see. But what it doesn't seem to have posted is that since this report came out, they have quietly removed from their board the position of ambassador for the foundation. The ambassador for the foundation was Ahmed Al-Shamsi, who was the UAE ambassador to Lebanon. I don't know why he's no longer posted as the ambassador, but it does seem rather odd that they haven't announced that. And I wonder rhetorically whether or not it's because they're subtly trying to loosen the links. I'll leave it there simply by saying this. We can't be sure that there's been an attempt to exert undue influence, absolutely. And I'm not saying for a moment that the day-to-day working body of Interpol has been unduly influenced. I'm not saying that for one moment at all. But what I am saying is that there appears to have been an enormous cash sum voluntarily provided by the UAE, and all the evidence tends to suggest that that may be an attempt by the UAE to try to buy some sort of undue influence. Khalid, I'll leave it there and pass back over to you, if I may.
Thank you so much, Rais, for all the facts that you mentioned in your speech. I think it is very important. This encourages us to even work harder to make sure that the UAE will not lead an organization such as UAE. And really, our peers are really very much justified. I believe strongly that UAE will try its best using the Interpol to our colleagues who are peacefully working in exile to promote human rights in UAE. With that, I move to our colleague, Emily Weber, who's going to talk about a complaint we made in France against the general and UAE. Yes, Emily, please.
There, sorry, I had to unmute. Thank you very much, Khalid. Indeed, I'm very happy to participate to this side event, and what has been exposed by Hiba, Ines, and Rais. Actually, we obviously fully agree. Interpol, the instrumentalization of Interpol, the instrumentalization of anti-terrorism laws and regulations at a national level, all of these are topics on which we work very often and regularly at the law firm. And we have witnessed a certain number of situations and cases in which these issues have been treated. Now, in the case of the Gulf Center for Human Rights, we have indeed filed a complaint on the 9th of June of this year against Al-Raisi. Here, we have filed a complaint before the prosecutor, the national prosecutor in France, for acts of torture and barbarous acts regarding the situation of Ahmed Mansour. Now, one of the very useful but complicated mechanism that exists in law and that you're all aware of is the universal jurisdiction that we have tried to trigger. Here, in France yeah, on this complaint. France has a long and very rich story and jurisprudence on the application and of the universal jurisdiction mechanism. France has signed and ratified the international treaties of 1984 against torture, all the Geneva Conventions. It's part to the Statute of Rome, and all of this has been incorporated directly in our national law in the criminal code. They are, to make it simple, there are 4 items which we have to look at here in France to trigger universal jurisdiction. The first is there must be a demonstration that the individual is in France. This is one of the elements on which there has been the most debate since the last 20, even 30 years in France. And the law has been changed several times, and I will come back to that a bit later, but there is again a new proposition of amendment that should be debated before the Senate soon. The law distinguishes the criteria according to the type of crimes that is targeted. If it's torture, the simple passage of an individual on the French territory is sufficient to retain the universal jurisdiction, the French jurisdiction on the basis of the universal jurisdiction. It's not the case for war crimes or crimes against humanity. For that, one must establish that the individual has a residence in France. The second item, which tribunal will look at, is that the initiative only belongs to the prosecutor. A complaint can be filed by an NGO, and actually all of the procedures in France with regards to universal jurisdiction have been initiated by NGOs for the past 30 years. There has been initiatives taken by Médecins Sans Frontières, Human Rights Watch, some civil organizations, groups of victims, association of victims, and now also the Gulf Center for Human Rights has joined this movement. And it's only under the pressure of these NGOs that investigations are triggered, and then eventually a procedure is initiated, and it also creates leverage at the international level, and I will come back to that also later. What is complicated is that once the complaint has been filed by the NGO, there must be a green light by the prosecutor to open an investigation or not. And when the prosecutor decides that he will not open an investigation, there is no recourse available against this decision. In common law matters, normally an NGO could move to the next step by filing what we call a complaint with a constitution of civil party, meaning we are forcing the opening of the investigation. We're passing through the prosecutor's decision, the prosecutor's refusal, and we are moving directly to an investigative judge. And an investigative judge will be seized and designated by the dean. This mechanism doesn't exist when it comes to universal jurisdiction. And it's this is still being debated. There are many voices calling to end this monopole of the prosecutor on the opening of investigations on the basis of universal jurisdiction, because if we take it from a very down-to-earth point of view, victims do not have any other way to obtain justice. There is no direct way to seize the ICC. They obviously don't have any means to seize jurisdiction, maybe perhaps in their national country, and the only way they can try to obtain justice is to seize a foreign jurisdiction. The third item is the double incrimination in both countries. This is a criteria that is set for all international crimes and acts of torture, except for genocide, of course, considering the absoluteness of the prohibition of genocide now legally accepted and reiterated also by the International Court of Justice. And the fourth item, which is a bit more, which is less strict today, and the courts here in France have been very flexible in the application of this this fourth criteria, is that well, there shouldn't be any other country or jurisdiction investigating on the same facts and requesting for extradition of the individual. Initially, France would request this emerged at the time that the ICTY and ICTR existed in The Hague and Arusha. Well, normally they would ask that they had the ICTY and ICTR declined jurisdiction for France to take over and conduct investigations themselves. This is not applied as strictly as before today. On these four criteria, we have examined them, and we have argued in our complaint that here they are fully passed, that all the conditions are united for the prosecutor to open the investigations on the case of General Al-Raisi with regards to the arrest and detention and acts of torture committed on Ahmed Mansour for many years now, which I mean, these facts are so solidly documented. So on the merits, we have no doubt that there is a case, and that there should be more than enough material in a few months to move on to a trial phase. Now, the real issue would be on the question whether the prosecutor will retain universal jurisdiction or not for France. William Bourdon, whom I'm replacing on this at this side event, has for the past 30 years, he has started to work on these issues in the early 90s. His first cases concerned the Rwandan genocide. And since then, there have been many decisions rendered. It was not an easy path. Some decisions in the early 80s. It all started with an order of a judge called Jean-Pierre Jetty, who's now retired, who's a prominent and respected judge in France, who at the time in the 90s had rendered an order saying, well, yes, France will have jurisdiction for acts of torture committed by these individuals who are susceptible to pass on our territory. If these individuals set foot in France, an investigation must be open and they must be arrested, and France should prosecute these facts. And at the same time, the same judge said, with regards to other crimes, international crimes, France is not competent and does not have jurisdiction. Well, the order of the judge Jetty was overturned by the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Cassation confirmed that the Court of Appeal was right in overturning his decision. His decision at the time was a shock in the legal community here, in human rights defenders community, because it really opened a gateway, and he was actually 15 or 20 years ahead of his generation, because today it is the case when there are acts of torture, if an individual a suspect passes on the French territory, an investigation can be open, and France will exercise its universal jurisdiction. The other issue I would like to discuss on this about this complaint is that it also sheds a light on the political influence, and this joins the issue of Interpol, which is it is a political organization. The political influence with regards to the complaint filed here in France is limited, but it is very existent. In 2000, William Baudon had filed a complaint at the time against General Naser, the Algerian general, who also had committed acts of torture between the 90s and the year 2000. And the prosecutor had retained universal jurisdiction because General Naser had announced that he would come to Paris to sign his latest book to his fans. And we had the certainty that he would come to Paris, and it would be a perfect occasion for an arrest and to place him under detention and start the investigations against him. While the judiciary, the judicial authority was ready, set, and had all the information, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was also aware of this complaint and never intervened when Algeria sent a private jet to the military airport of Le Bourget, just north of Paris, for General Naser to be immediately and urgently flown out of France and back to Algeria before the police could intervene to arrest him. We know that these cases are not without political influence, and it also explains, and it might also shed a light on why the prosecutor does not take the initiative, and why the role of NGOs is so crucial here in bringing the information, filing the complaint, and pushing the investigations forward. Prosecution authorities in France actually need this backup to move forward and trigger the investigations. There is sometimes actually there have been now quite a certain number of cases in which NGOs have succeeded in this. The International Federation for Human Rights has filed a complaint against the Mauritanian official Oulda, who was prosecuted and who was sentenced, although he at the time has said, well, there has been a law of amnesty in Mauritania, so you cannot prosecute me anymore. And that was also an opportunity for the French courts to say, we don't recognize the Mauritanian law on amnesty. We exercise our universal jurisdiction over these facts, and these facts are not concerned by any amnesty as long as we are concerned. There is one last major issue and reality, actually, to which we have to that we have to face in these cases, is that the prosecution authorities and French tribunals and courts will investigate and bring to trial and sentence when they have the elements. But to trigger all of this, the state of the case law still places the burden of the proof of the passage of an individual in France on the shoulders of the NGOs, which is extremely complicated, because it means that NGOs or civil society member or activists have to go through very extensive investigations to identify exactly what time, what date, which airplane, what location would an individual take and pass through, and pass all this information sufficiently ahead to the prosecution authorities for just to pass this little trigger moment, after which the prosecution will open the investigations. There are still a lot of debates, and there's still a lot of lobbying in France to improve the state of law on this specific aspect, because it's a burden which is too heavy to put on the shoulders of an organization, and let alone even some victims or member of the family of an individual who might be concerned. For the moment, we are still waiting for the prosecutor's reply on the complaint that has been filed. It was filed just before the summer, and as everyone knows, in France, summer is a period in which nothing will move at all. So now it is September, and we hope that we will have a reply quite soon. Just to add to this, we have, of course, annexed and cited the reports of David Calvert-Smith in the complaint. It was extremely useful. So thank you very much for that work. And we have also seized the working group on arbitrary detention as well on the case of Ahmed Mansour, as well as several special rapporteurs on his situation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you a lot, Emily, and really we thank you, and we thank your colleague, human rights lawyer William Borden, for all your work. We have other two cases, one against Saudi Arabia and General Ahmed Assi, and the third one against NSO, and we have a fourth one in UK against perpetrators of torture in a Gulf country. It is in its final stage, but in general, NGOs really are keen to use this concept of international jurisdiction due to the fact that there is no any local remedy to address all these massive violations. Now, we have a few minutes. I have to go back to Heba, and I just want to ask Heba if she's still with us. Is Heba there? I think she left. Maybe she has another meeting. So I will go to Inas. Inas, I just want to ask you, the General Assembly of Interpol is going to meet in November, and really probably we just need to do some work to take some actions prior to that meeting. Do you think that we should approach all members of the General Assembly? Is there anything in your mind about that?
That's a very good point, Khalid, and I definitely think we need to maybe follow up and strategize together about next steps. As always with NGOs, the problem is always a question of capacity and time that we can allocate. But yes, in principle, I think it would be great to actually reach out to all members of the General Assembly. I'm not an expert on the kind of process, but I assume that maybe those who are already in the board maybe have slightly more power and influence than others. I also saw a couple of days ago, actually, an official press release on the website of the UAE Minister of Interior, saying that Al-Raisi went actually to the United States to meet some officials and to kind of push for him to be elected during the elections. So I think it's becoming quite clear that they're in the last offensive lobbying, pushing phase, and yeah, we definitely should be doing.
Okay. So we will be in touch together with the other human rights partner. And I go to Rais for another question. Rais, do you think our fears are realistic when we say that the UAE is trying to get the presidency and then to misuse the red notice system and possibly extra what they call it, extradition to the extradition of the activists who are working peacefully. Some of them, I don't want to name the countries, but is that a real prospect for Emirat to do that within, you know, the international mechanisms?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that, in my mind anyway, that this is an attempt to buy the presidency and to exert influence. I mean, I recognise that the president doesn't have day-to-day control of the various mechanisms, and whilst he does have an agenda-setting ability, that's obviously going to be fettered by other member nations. But we should be in no doubt that for the UAE to grip the presidency would be a serious retrograde step. And even if it doesn't mean that they, for example, will be able to pull the levers and say that we will extradite this person, we'll get this red notice, they're going to keep pushing their agenda, and they're going to keep, you know, it seems to me that there's a clear need for reform of the red notice mechanism. Is it more or less likely that that's going to happen with an Emirati president? It's obviously less likely. And so I suspect what will happen is that they will just carry on as they've carried on before. And what we know about the red notice system is that you can stop it, but it's hard. And sometimes it gets stopped too late. And different countries have different attitudes. I mean, just look at the Uyghur activist that was arrested in Morocco recently. You know, that's a great example, it seems to me, of certain nations saying, oh yeah, we'll use it as a de facto request for extradition. So the long and short of it is, if it happens, it's bad news. You're muted, by the way.
Sorry. I go back finally to Emily, and I just want to ask you, like probably there is a possibility that the General Assembly of Interpol will meet online, but if there is a kind of physical meeting, probably we should cooperate with you. But what do you think preparations should be prior to this meeting in terms of the case that we have in France?
Well, besides the complaint and that has been filed already, I just shared a link to the last EU Parliament resolution that was adopted on the 16th of September, in which there is a call on the members of the General Assembly of Interpol, and especially the EU member states, to examine these allegations, amongst other issues regarding Ahmed Mansour's case. I think there is indeed, and I mean, many articles for the last year have been published. All international human rights organizations have unanimously expressed very serious concerns, and with regards to General Al-Raisi's candidacy. One might hope, as Rice mentioned, one might hope that Interpol is sufficiently aware of the difficulties it has known for the last years, especially with regards to the use and instrumentalization and the abuse of the red notice system. Interpol has tried to, for the last 4 years, it has reviewed its regulation, its procedures, to try to regain credibility amongst the international community. And now, if General Al-Raisi accedes to the presidency of the organization, that is basically the end of the credibility of the organization. And I would also like to recall one last point is that, and this is something we've worked on quite a lot because we have many cases regarding red notices that we file requests against with the Commission for the Control of Files of Interpol, is that when a red notice is issued, and of course here for the UAE, being at the presidency would just be a way to extend their state apparatus into the international Interpol apparatus. It will just be a puppet for them. But when a red notice or any notice actually is issued by Interpol, it is a mechanism of cooperation, and member states, though they are normally they have to comply and they have to arrest or search individuals on the basis of these red notice, member states are always sovereign not to do so. And they are sovereign to refuse this cooperation. There is no sanction, of course, by Interpol on this. And unfortunately, if General Al-Raisi becomes president of the organization, no matter how strong the communication of Interpol can be to try to legitimize such a vote, we then must hope, and perhaps this is something that can be called to the attention of the members of the General Assembly ahead of the election, that many member states will not cooperate as they do today with the organization of Interpol. And I'm thinking about France, notably perhaps the United States. It will be a very hard blow on the organization itself. So there is the issue of funding, and beyond that, as Rice mentioned, but beyond the money, there is, well, you can put as much money as you want in an organization, but if its member states does not cooperate anymore, the organization is not as strong as it should be.
Thank you a lot, Emily. And with that, I think we have a united call to make our case for all the countries that have a high standard of human rights to work hard from now, prior to the meeting of the General Assembly, to make sure that UAE is not going to be elected for the presidency, and General Ahmed Al-Raisi is not going to be successful in his attempt. And this is worrying that he is going to US to promote his presidency. So with that, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers, Heba Ziadin, Inas Osman, and Rice Davis, and Emily Blaver. I wish you all the success in your work. We will be in touch. We will do more communications prior to the General Assembly, and hopefully our efforts will be successful. I think we have a good chance to lobby many governments who share the same concerns. A country that is until now torturing defenders, put them in prison, shouldn't lead the Interpol. Thank you so much, and I wish you a very good day. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.